Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are on Lesson 13, Chapter 13, which is taking control of backgrounds and borders. What we're going to learn in this lesson today is how to layer backgrounds. We're going to learn how to use gradients as backgrounds. We're going to learn how to use CSS properties to create zebra stripe tables automatically. We're going to learn how to create rounded corners on elements. We're going to learn how to use images as borders, and we're going to learn how outlines are different from borders. So this is a good chapter. Almost every website you go to is going to have some type of background, whether it be a color, a gradient, an image. And I would say it's pretty essential to web development. In other lessons, we learn how to add basic borders and backgrounds to our elements. There's much more we can do to dress up our web pages and make it look good. In a lot of ways, CSS backgrounds define modern designs. We're going to learn how to layer background images on our elements and use gradients that are created by the CSS itself as background. Borders are just as important. Every element has a border, even if it isn't visible. Remember, we talked about that. Everything has an imaginary rectangle box, every element. And whether we style it or not, that border is there. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to adjust the borders of our elements to make our designs a lot more interesting and cool. We're going to learn how to create rounded corners, and using images as borders is pretty interesting. We'll learn a little more about the CSS outline property and how that actually differs from borders. So we're going to start off this chapter. It goes over reviewing background and border basics, so we understand how to add the background, how to add a border, and what we can do with some of those properties. A background has a lot of properties, such as background image, position, size, etc. And same thing with border width, and border color properties. You can use 10 different border style keywords, such as solid, none, hidden, dashed, dotted, double, groove, etc. So there's a lot of properties that go with these. And then it goes through and talks about using multiple borders and backgrounds. There's a really good example in your book in chapter 13 of how to add multiple backgrounds. It talks about alternating background colors. So we introduced something called the nth child. So when you build tables, especially ones with a lot of data, the coloring of the background as the rows can make them much easier to read. So you've probably seen this before. I know you probably had a lab a couple lessons back on how to alternate the colors of the backgrounds in a table. So to do this, you don't use a background CSS property, but rather the nth child pseudo class. What it does is the nth child selector takes an attribute in the parentheses. The attribute can be one of the following. It can be a single integer, which just selects that one element, such as just the fourth row of a table or just the fifth row. Or it can do even, which selects only even numbered elements, or odd, which selects the odd number elements. You can also use a formula, which selects the elements that match the formula. So you can create zebra stripe tables. You can just use the even or odd keywords and do in the table body, every row, nth child, and in parentheses put odd or even, and and then you add the background color. And then it tells the browser to examine every row inside the table body element and add a gray background or whatever color background to the first row, third row, fifth row, and so on if you're doing it odd. Another important thing is using gradients as backgrounds. You can use linear or radial gradients. Gradients, they change color along a line or from a point. So what they do is they take two or more colors and fade from one to the next. Linear goes along a line. Radial starts at a single point and emanates outward. And you'll see this a lot. People will use gradient backgrounds. It just makes it look a lot nicer. So your book goes through examples of how to do this. And then it talks about rounding the corners of HTML elements. Most buttons that you see on web pages nowadays are rounded. Early 2000s, late 90s, you see a lot of square buttons. Everything was very rectangular, very square. Nowadays, you see the rounded corners on the buttons. So how do we do this? Well, it's something called the border radius property. You can make the corners as round or as square as you like. You just define the amount of curve you want for the corners. So coming up next, I'm going to share my screen with you and show you some examples that are in Lesson 13, Chapter 13. Here's an example of how to use rounded corners, or the border radius property. If you look in this HTML here, set up some paragraphs, gave them an ID, some text. If you look at the CSS, round 1 is the first one, round 2 is the second one, round 3 is the third one. This first one has a border radius of 25 pixels, which is this curve right here. This one has 75 pixels, which is why it's a more drastic curve, and this one only has 15, which is why it's not as drastic as a curve. The background is this color here, the padding, and the width is 200 pixels. This one width is 300 pixels, so it's wider, and this one is only 100 pixels wide. So here's an example of how to use the border radius property with backgrounds in your elements and different types of rounded corners. Next we have is learning the difference between background attachment values. This is scroll, meaning that the content will scroll through. Notice that this moves up and down, and notice on the right here is this scroll bar. So all your content will scroll through and the image will maintain its position in the background. Fixed, notice how I'm scrolling and the image is larger, stays in place, and this area moves over a different spot in the image, and I can also scroll the content, but when I scroll the page, it moves. Local, meaning that inside this, I can move this image. Then when I move the page, when I get to the bottom, or when I move this and scroll. So that's local, this is fixed, this is scroll. So let's look at how we do that in the code. We set our divs, and we added that image to all three of these classes, which are right here, scroll, fixed, local. And then what we're going to do is for scroll, we do background attachment scroll, fixed, we do background attachment fixed, and for local, we do background attachment local. And this is how you can learn the difference between background attachment values. Well, I hope those examples helped. Practice them, work through them, go through the examples in your book, and go through my example, and try to add a little bit, make it your own, change the colors, change the size around, and just get comfortable with using those new properties that we learned. Coming up next, we have our PowerPoint presentation for Chapter 13, Lesson 13, so stay tuned.